The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered buildings of Copper Ridge, a town that had seen better days. Tumbleweeds rolled lazily down Main Street, past the faded storefronts and empty hitching posts. The silver boom had ended 3 years ago, leaving behind a skeleton of what once was a thriving community. Thomas McKenna rode his horse slowly through the town, his weathered face shadowed by the brim of his worn hat. At 42, he carried the weight of too many disappointments, a failed marriage, a ranch that barely kept him afloat, and the crushing loneliness that came with working the land by himself. His wife, Sarah, had left 2 years ago, unable to bear the isolation and his increasing withdrawal into silence. The general store needed supplies, and Thomas needed human contact, even if it was just a brief exchange with old Pete Morrison behind the counter. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Pete looked up from his ledger with tired eyes. "Morning, Thomas." "The usual. Coffee, flour, and whatever news you've got," Thomas replied, his voice rough from days of talking only to his cattle. Pete shook his head grimly. "Nothing good, I'm afraid. Word is that Apache raids are picking up again south of here. Sheriff's been talking about forming another posse." Thomas paid for his supplies, without comment. The cycle of violence between the settlers and the Apache had been going on for years, each side striking back at the other in an endless spiral of revenge. He'd seen enough blood to last a lifetime and wanted no part of it. As he loaded his supplies onto his horse, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the north end of town. A group of riders appeared through the heat shimmer, led by Jake Brennan, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him wherever he went. Brennan made his living as a bounty hunter, tracking down wanted men and collecting the rewards. Behind Brennan, slumped over a horse with her hands bound, was a young Apache woman. Her long black hair hung loose around her face, and even from a distance, Thomas could see the defiance in her posture despite her obvious exhaustion. The small crowd that gathered began to murmur. Some called out cruel suggestions about what should be done with her. Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the ugly mood building in the air. Jake Brennan dismounted with theatrical flair, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the dusty ground. He was a man who enjoyed an audience, and Copper Ridge's desperate residents were eager for any distraction from their failing town. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brennan called out, his voice carrying across the small crowd that had gathered, "I present to you Ayanna, wanted for the murder of 3 settlers near Tucson. There's a $500 bounty on her head." The Apache woman, Ayanna, lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes scanning the hostile faces around her. Thomas was struck by her dignity despite her circumstances. She couldn't have been more than 25, with high cheekbones and an intelligent gaze that seemed to take in everything around her. "She speaks English," Brennan continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Educated by missionaries before she went back to her savage ways. Isn't that right, sweetheart?" Ayanna's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Thomas noticed how her hands, though bound, remained steady. There was no trembling, no sign of the fear that any normal person would feel in such a situation. Sheriff Collins pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the sunlight. He was a decent man, but Thomas could see the conflict in his eyes. The town needed that bounty money, and Collins had a job to do. "You got proof of her crimes, Brennan?" Collins asked. Brennan pulled out a crumpled wanted poster. "Right here. Dead or alive, it says. Though I figure the folks of Tucson might want to see justice done proper-like." The crowd murmured approval, but Thomas felt sick. He'd heard the stories of what passed for justice in some of these frontier towns. Lynch mobs and kangaroo courts that had more to do with bloodlust than law. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the town's only doctor and one of the few women who'd stayed after the boom ended, pushed forward. "She's injured," she said, her voice cutting through the crowd's chatter. "Look at her shoulder." Indeed, Thomas could now see the dark stain on Ayanna's shirt, the way she held her left arm close to her body. The doctor's humanitarian instincts were kicking in, but Thomas knew it wouldn't matter to most of the crowd. "Doc's right," Thomas found himself saying, stepping forward. "Woman's hurt. Whatever she's done, she deserves medical attention." Brennan's cold eyes fixed on Thomas. "And who might you be to tell me how to handle my prisoner?" Thomas McKenna. I run a ranch outside town. Thomas kept his voice level, but inside he was questioning why he was getting involved. This wasn't his fight. Well, Mr. McKenna, unless you're planning to pay me that $500 yourself, I suggest you mind your own business. The crowd laughed, but Thomas noticed that Dr. Hayes was studying him with interest. She'd been trying to get someone to listen to reason, and now she had an unexpected ally. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Father Miguel Santos, the town's Catholic priest. The elderly Mexican man had served Copper Ridge for over a decade, ministering to miners, ranchers, and anyone else who would listen. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen too much suffering. "Senor Brennan," Father Santos said, his accented English carrying the authority of his office. "This woman needs medical attention. Surely you can see that." Brennan's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged, especially by a priest whose congregation included several Mexican families that some townspeople viewed with suspicion. "She's a murderer, Padre. Don't let her pretty face fool you." "I am not fooled by anyone's face," Father Santos replied calmly. "But I am a man of God, and I will not stand by while someone suffers needlessly." Dr. Hayes stepped forward again. "Father Santos is right. Whatever her crimes, she's a human being who needs treatment. I can examine her in my office." "And then what?" Brennan demanded. "You patch her up so she can escape?" "I don't think so." Thomas felt the weight of the moment. The crowd was growing restless, and he could sense the potential for violence. Ayanna remained silent, but her eyes were alert, watching every face, every movement. "I'll stand guard," Thomas heard himself saying. "In the doctor's office. That way she gets treatment, and Brennan keeps his prisoner." Brennan studied Thomas with calculating eyes. "What's your interest in this, rancher? You got feelings for Apache squaws." The insult hung in the air like a physical thing. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I've got feelings about doing what's right. Nothing more." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. "It's a reasonable compromise. We can tend to her wounds under guard." Sheriff Collins, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "I think that's fair. Brennan, you get your prisoner back healthy. Doctor, you get to do your job. Everyone wins." Brennan clearly didn't like it, but he was outnumbered by the town's most respectable citizens. "Fine, but if she escapes, it's on your heads." As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas found himself walking alongside Dr. Hayes and Father Santos toward the doctor's office. Ayanna was helped down from her horse, and Thomas noticed how she moved with careful grace despite her injury. "Thank you," she said quietly as they reached the office door. Her English was indeed perfect, with only the slightest accent. Thomas nodded, unsure why he'd gotten involved. He told himself it was just about doing what was right, but as their eyes met for a moment, he felt something shift inside him, a recognition of shared loneliness, perhaps, or simply the human need to connect with another soul. Dr. Hayes's office was a small but well-equipped space above the general store. Thomas positioned himself by the door while the doctor examined Ayanna's shoulder wound. Father Santos had remained as well, his presence adding a sense of dignity to the proceedings. "The bullet went clean through," Dr. Hayes announced after her examination. "No infection yet, but it needs proper cleaning and bandaging." Ayanna bore the treatment stoically, her face showing no pain even when the doctor cleaned the wound with alcohol. Thomas found himself impressed by her resilience. "How did you learn English so well?" Dr. Hayes asked as she worked. "Mission school," Ayanna replied simply. "From age 7 to 15. And then I remembered who I was." The simple statement carried weight. Thomas understood something about losing and finding identity. His own journey, from hopeful young husband to bitter, isolated rancher, had taught him about the different selves a person could be. Father Santos leaned forward. "The missions, they are not always kind places." Ayanna's eyes flickered to the priest. "Some are better than others. The sisters meant well, but they wanted to kill the Apache in me to save the Christian." "And you chose to return to your people," Dr. Hayes said, not judging, simply stating fact. "I chose to be whole." Thomas found himself studying her face as she spoke. There was intelligence there, and a depth of experience that spoke of someone who had lived between two worlds. It reminded him of his own sense of not quite belonging anywhere. "These charges against you," he said suddenly, "are they true?" Ayana's dark eyes met his directly. "I defended my village when soldiers came to relocate us. 3 men died. Whether that makes me a murderer depends on which side of the gun you stand on." The honesty in her voice cut through Thomas like a blade. He'd seen enough of frontier justice to know that the line between victim and perpetrator often depended on who was telling the story. Dr. Hayes finished her work and stepped back. "There. The wound should heal properly now. You'll need to keep it clean and dry." "Thank you," Ayana said simply. A commotion outside interrupted them. Through the window, Thomas could see Jake Brennan talking animatedly with several men, including some of the rougher elements who frequented the town's only saloon. The bounty hunter's gestures were becoming more aggressive, and Thomas didn't like what he was seeing. "Father," he said quietly, "maybe you should go see what's happening down there." Father Santos nodded and headed for the door. Within minutes, he was back, his face grim. "Brennan is stirring up trouble. He's telling people that the Apache are planning raids, that keeping her here is dangerous. Some of the men are talking about taking justice into their own hands." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen lynch mobs before, had witnessed what happened when fear and anger overrode reason. How long before they come up here? Not long, I think. Thomas looked at Ayana, who had listened to the exchange with growing alertness. Her bound hands were clenched, but her face remained calm. "We need to get her out of here," he said. The decision came to Thomas with surprising clarity. He couldn't stand by and watch an innocent woman, for he was now convinced of her innocence, be handed over to a mob. The fact that she was Apache, that she was different, that she didn't fit into the narrow definitions of who deserved protection in this harsh land, made no difference to him. "Dr. Hayes," he said, "cut her bonds." The doctor looked startled. "Thomas, you can't be serious. You'll be charged with helping a prisoner escape." "Maybe, but I won't be charged with standing by while someone gets lynched." Father Santos stepped forward. "There may be another way. The church has sanctuary laws." "This isn't medieval Europe, Father," Thomas replied. "These men won't respect sanctuary." Ayana spoke quietly. "I will not run and leave you to face the consequences of my freedom." Thomas was struck by her words. In his experience, most people, faced with the choice between their safety and someone else's welfare, chose their own. But this woman, who had every reason to hate the people of this town, was concerned about his welfare. "You don't understand," he said. "If that mob gets hold of you." "I understand perfectly. I have seen what your people do when they are afraid." The sounds from outside were growing louder. Thomas could hear Brennan's voice rising above the others, stoking their anger. Time was running out. "There's a back way out," Dr. Hayes said suddenly. "Through the alley behind the building. If you can get to your horse." "No," Thomas said firmly. "Running won't solve anything. They'll just come after us, and next time there might not be anyone around to stop them." He moved to the window and looked down at the growing crowd. Maybe 20 men now, their faces hard with the kind of righteousness that came from having someone to blame for all their problems. "I'm going down there," he announced. "Thomas, no," Dr. Hayes protested. "You can't face them alone." "I won't be alone." He looked at Father Santos. "Will I, Father?" The old priest straightened his shoulders. "No, my son, you will not." Thomas checked his sidearm, not because he intended to use it, but because he knew the crowd would respect the fact that he was armed. Then he looked at Ayana one more time. "Whatever happens, know that not all of us are like Brennan." "I know," she said simply. "That is why I trust you." The words hit Thomas harder than any physical blow. When was the last time someone had said they trusted him? When was the last time he'd felt worthy of trust? He and Father Santos made their way downstairs and out onto Main Street. The crowd had gathered in front of the general store, and Thomas could see the ugly mood that had settled over them like a dark cloud. "McKenna," Brennan called out as soon as he spotted them. "You done playing nursemaid to that savage?" Thomas stepped into the center of the street, Father Santos beside him. "I'm done watching good people act like animals." The crowd murmured angrily, but Thomas continued. "This woman hasn't been tried by any court. She hasn't been found guilty of anything. And you want to string her up based on the word of a bounty hunter who gets paid whether she's guilty or not." "She's Apache," someone shouted from the crowd. "That's enough." "Is it?" Thomas's voice carried across the dusty street. "Because I seem to remember this town being built by people who came here looking for a better life. People who wanted to be judged by their actions, not their blood." Sheriff Collins pushed through the crowd, his face troubled. Thomas could see the conflict in the lawman's eyes, duty warring with conscience. "Thomas, you need to step aside," Collins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I need to do what's right," Thomas replied. "And so do you, Sheriff." Brennan stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "I'm getting tired of this. I've got a legal bounty, and I'm going to collect it." "What court issued that bounty?" Father Santos asked suddenly. Brennan's eyes flickered. "What? The bounty? What court issued it? Who signed the warrant?" Thomas saw the uncertainty cross Brennan's face. "It doesn't matter. She's wanted." "It matters to me," Sheriff Collins said, stepping closer. "Let me see that paper again." With obvious reluctance, Brennan handed over the wanted poster. Collins studied it carefully, his frown deepening. "This isn't an official warrant," he said finally. "This is just a reward notice, posted by private citizens." "So," Brennan demanded, "so without an official warrant, you have no legal authority to hold this woman. You're just a kidnapper." The crowd shifted uneasily. The legal technicality might not matter to them, but it mattered to Sheriff Collins, and he was the only law in Copper Ridge. Dr. Hayes appeared at the top of the stairs outside her office. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you." Collins looked up. "What is it, Doc?" "This woman, Ayanna, she's told me something that changes everything." Brennan's face darkened. "Don't listen to her lies." "I'll listen to whoever I want to listen to," Collins snapped. "Doc, bring her down here." A moment later, Ayanna appeared on the stairs, her hands still bound but her posture straight and proud. She looked out over the hostile crowd, without flinching. "Tell them what you told me," Dr. Hayes said gently. Ayanna's voice carried clearly across the street. "The 3 men who died were not killed by me. They were killed by other soldiers when they tried to stop the massacre of my village." "Lies," Brennan shouted. "I can prove it." Ayanna continued calmly. "One of the soldiers survived. He is being treated at the Mission Hospital in Tucson. His name is Corporal James Mitchell. He will tell you the truth." Sheriff Collins looked thoughtful. "And what is the truth?" "That the 3 men who died were trying to protect Apache women and children from being murdered. They were killed by their own people for showing mercy." The crowd was silent now, processing this information. Thomas felt a surge of admiration for Ayanna's courage in speaking the truth, even when it might not be believed. "Even if that's true," someone called out, "she's still Apache. Still the enemy." Ayanna turned to face the voice. "I am Apache, yes, but I am not your enemy unless you make me one. I have lived in both worlds, yours and mine. I know that there are good people and bad people in both." Father Santos stepped forward. "This woman speaks wisdom. How many of us have judged others by their blood rather than their actions?" Thomas looked around at the faces in the crowd. Some were still hard with prejudice, but others were beginning to show doubt. The mob's certainty was cracking. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out on Sheriff Collins's face. The lawman was torn between his duty to keep the peace and his growing conviction that Ayanna was innocent. Brennan, sensing that the crowd's mood was shifting, made a desperate play. "You're all being fooled by a pretty face and a sad story. This woman is dangerous. She's Apache, and Apaches kill white folk. That's what they do. That's what some of them do," Thomas said, stepping closer to Brennan. "Just like some white folk kill Apaches. But that doesn't make all of us murderers." "You defending her because you're sweet on her, McKenna?" Brennan sneered. Thomas felt his temper flare, but he kept his voice steady. I'm defending her because it's the right thing to do. Because if we don't stand up for justice when it's inconvenient, then we don't deserve to call ourselves civilized. Dr. Hayes moved down the stairs to stand beside Thomas and Father Santos. I've examined her wounds. They're consistent with her story. She was shot while trying to protect others. And I've examined the bounty notice, Sheriff Collins added. It's not an official warrant. Brennan has no legal authority here. The bounty hunter's face was flushed with anger. You're all making a mistake. When she kills someone else, it'll be on your heads. No, Ayanna said quietly, and all eyes turned to her. If I kill someone, it will be on my head, just as your actions are on yours. The simple dignity of her words struck Thomas like a physical blow. Here was a woman who took responsibility for her actions, who didn't hide behind excuses or blame others for her choices. I propose a compromise, Sheriff Collins said suddenly. Miss Ayanna, you're free to go, but I'm asking you to stay in town for a few days while I send a telegram to Tucson. If your story checks out, that'll be the end of it. Brennan exploded. You can't do that. I've got money invested in this. You've got money invested in kidnapping. Collins shot back. And if you don't like my decision, you can take it up with the territorial authorities. The crowd was beginning to disperse, the drama over. Some men looked disappointed, as if they'd been cheated out of entertainment. Others seemed relieved that they wouldn't have blood on their hands. Thomas looked at Ayanna, who was still standing on the stairs. You'll need a place to stay. I can camp outside town, she said. No, Thomas found himself saying. You can stay at my ranch, at least until this gets sorted out. The offer surprised him as much as it surprised everyone else. He hadn't planned to say it, but now that the words were out, he realized he meant them. Dr. Hayes smiled. That's very generous of you, Thomas. Brennan spat in the dust. You're all fools. Mark my words, you'll regret this. As the bounty hunter stalked away, Thomas felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. 3 days later, Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ayanna sat beside him, her shoulder healing well under Dr. Hayes's care. The telegram from Tucson had arrived that morning, confirming her story in every detail. Corporal Mitchell had not only corroborated her account, but had described her as a hero who had saved his life. Brennan left town this morning, Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. I know. I saw him go. Sheriff Collins says you're free to leave anytime you want. Ayanna nodded, but didn't speak. They'd been having this conversation for the past 2 days, dancing around the question of what would happen next. Where will you go? Thomas asked. I don't know. My village is gone. The mission won't take me back. I exist between worlds now. Thomas understood that feeling all too well. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the spaces between worlds are where the most interesting people live. She turned to look at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart skip. Is that what you are, Thomas McKenna? An interesting person living between worlds? I'm trying to be. It's been a long time since I've had a reason to try. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Father Santos appeared on the horizon, riding toward the ranch with Dr. Hayes beside him. Visitors, Ayanna observed. Good visitors, Thomas replied, rising to greet them. Father Santos dismounted with a grunt. Getting too old for all this riding. What brings you out here, Father? Thomas asked. News from town. And a proposition. Dr. Hayes stepped forward. The town council met today. They've decided to offer you a position, Ayanna. What kind of position? Teacher, for the Mexican children in town. Someone who speaks both English and Spanish would be valuable. Ayanna looked surprised. I don't speak Spanish. But you understand what it's like to live between cultures, Father Santos said. That's even more valuable. Thomas felt his heart racing. If Ayanna stayed in town, she would be close enough to visit. Close enough for what? He wasn't sure, but he knew he wanted to find out. There's something else. Dr. Hayes continued. The town needs a deputy sheriff, someone who can work with the Mexican families, help bridge the gap between communities. Are you offering me a job, Doctor? Thomas asked. I'm offering you a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. Both of you. Thomas looked at Ayanna, who was studying him with those intelligent dark eyes. What do you think? I think, she said slowly, that I've spent too long running from one world to another. Maybe it's time to help build a new one. Father Santos smiled. That's the spirit. God works in mysterious ways, bringing people together when they need each other most. As the priest and doctor prepared to leave, Thomas walked Ayanna to the edge of the porch. The desert stretched out before them, vast and beautiful in the dying light. Are you sure about this? He asked. Staying in a town that nearly lynched you? I'm sure about you, she said simply. You stood up for me when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That tells me something about the kind of man you are. And what kind of man is that? The kind worth knowing better. Thomas felt something warm unfold in his chest. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of something he'd thought was lost forever. I'd like that, getting to know you better. Even if I'm Apache, especially because you're Apache, because you're brave and intelligent and honest, because you make me want to be a better man. She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, making her look younger and more vulnerable. Then we'll build this new world together, Thomas McKenna, one day at a time. As they stood there watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Thomas felt the loneliness that had haunted him for so long finally beginning to lift. He'd found something worth fighting for, something worth building toward, and in finding it, he'd found himself. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the promise of new beginnings and the hope that sometimes, even in the harshest places, love could take root and grow. Thomas McKenna, the lonely rancher, was lonely no more, and Ayanna, the woman caught between worlds, had found a place where she belonged. Together, they would write a new chapter in the story of Copper Ridge, one built on understanding, respect, and the recognition that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest act of bravery is simply choosing to see the humanity in another person.